It's kind of funny to get to my age and realize that I've never been asked why I believe in God. Sometimes people ask you if you believe in God, but the question of why doesn't seem very important, secondary, or even irrelevant. Do you believe in God? Oh, that's what matters. If you say yes, then check, you're okay. And, well, I don't know how you can believe in God and not be interested in the why. And that's why I wanted to make a series of videos. The first few that I'm going to undertake are actually not going to explain a specific reason for why I believe in God so much as why I'm convinced that we cannot know if there's a God or not. In other words, to turn it around in the other direction, don't tell me that there is no God and you can prove it, because you can't. I can't prove that there is either. That's why it's called faith. But science cannot prove that God does not exist. And I'm going to make my case based on a book that was very important to me in my youth, The Critique of Pure Reason by the German philosopher Kant, translated by Norman Kemp Smith in this version. This is actually the original book that I read 40-something years ago, and it really changed my life. I shied away from Kant for a long time because, Critique of Pure Reason, does he have some kind of beef with reason? I wasn't interested in that. Growing up in the 60s and 70s, I was so sick of people who just were about nothing but emotions and impulse, and I figured, well, this is one of those Rousseau-esque works from the 18th century about how reason was the enemy of true feeling. And Kant, you couldn't be farther off base. Kant is exactly the opposite of that in his approach. A critique, in his sense, is kind of a mapping out of parameters. He's trying to create a design, a blueprint of how human rationality looks and works without the specific content that individuals would bring to the blueprint. This is the skeleton of our rational mind. And it's fascinating stuff. I think the climax of the critique has to be a section called the antinomies of pure reason. And pardon my going so high tech here. This is called handwriting. And anyway, maybe you can read that up at the top. But an antinomy is a set of laws, or nomoi. You know what anti means. The laws are actually working against themselves. Both of them are compelling, but ironically, if you take the two of them together as true, as you must, because their logical foundation is equally strong, then they contradict each other. And there's a set of these antinomies undergirding our human rationality. So the way that our mind thinks is actually is contradictory. If you insist that we have the capacity to appreciate ultimate truth, we can't, because when you strip away content once again and just look at the blueprint shows that our means of processing things are diametrically opposed. They don't. Let me show you. Let me just show you this is not actually entirely Kant. I've tried to boil it down into ways that make sense to me. You can see that I have time on one side of my diagram and space on the other. And analysis and synthesis are important terms. All of this is Greek stuff, but analysis means that you unzip, that you release all the way along the line. You pick things apart, you dissect them. Synthesis means that you put them together. You're constructing things. So these are two complementary movements, in a sense opposite movements of our mind. We pull things into smaller pieces in order to understand them, but of course we also put them back together in order to fabricate a full explanation. Now over on this side of the diagram, I've opposed the what I call the quantitative or the definite and the qualitative or the indefinite. And again, I'm kind of taking liberties with Kant's terms. I'm putting this in language that makes sense to me, but it probably makes more sense to you too than something really 18th century and Greek. The idea behind a quantity is that it can be enumerated. It's made up of units, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can count the books on the shelf behind me. Now, no two of those books are the same, but we can identify each one of them as a book and we can count them up. So we're not interested in their quality and how thick they are and what color they are and so forth. We're just interested in the fact that each one of them is a book and we can tabulate them. And of course, that's one gear that our rationality has in trying to understand things. We can also take things and not ignore but de-emphasize their quantitative identity and pay more attention to their quantity. I use the word indefinite because definite, finis is the Latin word for a boundary, and obviously something that can be counted has boundaries. That's how we can identify this, and this as 3 units. Something that's indefinite is something in which the boundaries have been relaxed. So now we can start to notice its quality, and we can, for instance, notice the different colors of those books. Some of them they catch your eye immediately. Some of the books are taller, and so forth. And the mind shifts back and forth between these different registers. When we do science, we notice that a certain phenomenon is made up of X components that, it's like looking at the parts, the cogs that make an engine turn. But we can also break this machine into smaller pieces. And, why does it run better on cold days than hot days or with a certain fuel or something? We're starting to look at it more qualitatively. Then we can shift back into a more quantitative conclusion and so forth. This is the kind of back and forth pendulum working of the mind is just characteristic. See, this is what I mean by critique. This is how we think. This is how we work. Now, I'm not going to have time in this opening video to get all of this in, and I do want to explain these 4 different points. Let me just see if I can squeeze in the first 2 squares under time and space. When we look at time, we have an obvious assumption that we make, and I better make sure that I can read what I've written. Time is made up of, there must be a smallest unit of time. This has been sometimes called the chronon. Otherwise, events would never progress. How would you, it's the old fable about the Achilles is racing the rabbit, and actually that has to do, I should put that over on the side with space, but the same idea applies to time. No, actually that one, I guess that does apply to time. If Achilles certainly runs faster than the rabbit, but if the rabbit gets a head start on him and Achilles has to catch up with the rabbit, say he needs 10 seconds for that, well, first he has to cover 5 seconds of ground, and then he has to cover 2.5, and then he has to cover, what would that be, 1.25, and so forth, and you start dividing time. I guess that is a space conundrum too. It works on both time and space. You can kind of peek ahead to the spatial quandary. There's the same idea that space must be made up of atoms, things that cannot be divided beyond a certain point. The chronon and the atom are both the irreducible components of time and space. We can't think of those two dimensions in any other way. Otherwise, you'd just keep dividing them and dividing them further and dividing them further, and Achilles would never catch up with a rabbit, and we know that that's ridiculous because Achilles is much faster than a rabbit, so that doesn't describe what we actually see in reality. But it's logical, isn't it? I mean, you have to assume that there's a piece at the bottom of all the analysis which itself cannot be analyzed. It cannot be further unzipped, or otherwise everything, time and space, it seems like they would just keep falling inward as you unzipped one part after another, after another, after another, and it would go on forever. There would be no unitary event forming. There would be no object. There would be, my glasses, my watch here. There would be no single thing that could be made up of these particles, because they'd all, you just take it and squish it and it would disappear. Things would collapse forever. So there is an irreducible component at the bottom of everything. Doesn't that make sense? But it can't be the ultimate truth, because, let me read what I read. There cannot be a smallest unit of time, otherwise the wait for a chronon to elapse would be zero. Well, that's phrased kind of cryptically, but what I mean there is that if the, say in time, if there's a tiniest possible little event that takes place, then it can't be divided in two, right? So it must be, and it's over, and that must be zero. That value would be something, because anything greater than zero can be divided, and we're saying that the chronon is indivisible, so therefore it must be nothing. Great. So now we're looking at events that are composed of an elementary instant in time whose value is zero. But we know that no matter how many, you could have an infinite number of zeros and you still have zero. Oops, that doesn't make any sense. And the same with time. There cannot be a smallest unit of space, otherwise the atom's outside would also be its inside. That's another way of saying that the atom, does it take up space? Well, if it takes up space, then it has a measure. And if it has a measure, then you would be able to further divide it. If you can't further divide it, then its outside is also its inside. See, this is, as I said, with time, it's like saying that the diameter of this tiny little, the true atom, the true ultimate indivisible component of things, is zero. That's the object that can no longer be divided. But how can anything be made up of an infinite amount of objects whose diameter is zero? Impossible. And yet both of those, in both of the squares, both of those propositions are equally logical. They're equally compelling to our rational mind. And Kant's conclusion from this is that there must be a broader reality that our mind is not built to understand. It's not just that we don't understand it yet. We cannot understand it in our present dimensions, in our, confined as we are to our present rational limitations. So this is going to pave the way for the possibility of belief, because belief is not and cannot be shut off at this point by anything that our rational mind is telling us. On the contrary, it tells us that there must be something more.